That's right. Bear down, Bears fans. It's time for another edition of the Chicago Bears podcast, Bears Banter, powered by Second City Gridiron. Bill Zimmerman with you. We are back after a week off. I hope you all enjoyed the holidays. Holidays aren't over yet. We got New Year's Eve, New Year's Day coming up, college football quarterfinals, plenty of great sports action. But let's talk Chicago Bears, because we as Chicago sports fans love to be miserable, and the Chicago Bears certainly provide that for us, and did again after a stellar effort against the Seattle Seahawks. No guests today, no mailbag today. Just wanted to talk a little Bears here. We'll call it a mini Bears banter. We'll get back into the full swing next week after the Bears wrap up their season against the Green Bay Packers. Should have a guest next week, but I want to do the podcast may be a day or two delayed because I need to wait and see about Ryan Poles' fate. And we're going to talk about Ryan Poles' fate here in a minute, because I think it's a fascinating situation that's going on right now behind closed doors at Hallis Hall. But let's talk briefly about this Seahawks game. This Seahawks game was just an absolutely pathetic performance on so many different levels. And it really was kind of a microcosm of the season, right? Like, I mean, the defense was okay. It was a lot of Seattle shooting themselves in the foot. The defense played pretty well. But when you look at it offensively, there was just so many issues, so many penalties. Of course, the holding penalty that cost Caleb Williams a fantastic touchdown. And the one thing I'm always careful about, because we did it a lot with Mitch Trubisky. Then we started doing it with Justin Fields, where we try and make it all the perfect things around the quarterback. If this happened, if that happened, then they would have had a great play here, a great play there. But when they make the great play and it's caught and it's a touchdown and it's a holding penalty that really it wasn't like a massive impact on the play. Like sometimes there's a holding penalty that prevents a sack, and you say, well, if you didn't hold the guy, the quarterback never would have gotten it off. That wasn't as much of an issue here. So you see again the glimpses of Caleb Williams, and these aren't glimpses like Mitch Trubisky. And again, when I knock these guys, just understand, I'm just trying to compare the quarterbacks we've had to the quarterback we presently have for the Chicago Bears. Mitch Trubisky, right? We saw flashes with Mitch Trubisky. We saw him the ability to run. He wasn't crazy athletic like Justin Fields, but he knew how to pick up 7-8 yards when he needed to. He was quick with his feet. We saw some occasional arm talent there from Mitch. Like, we saw him have the ability to get things done. And I think when we saw Mitch succeed in 2018, we saw a quarterback that had a chance to be good. I don't think a lot of us sat here and said, this quarterback can be great. This quarterback can be a top 5-6 quarterback. I think we saw a quarterback that said, this guy could be like Kirk Cousins, maybe. And we were pretty pleased. And obviously 2019 regression, 2020 Nick Foles, 2021 Andy Dalton. We know the disasters that followed, of course. But we thought Mitch could be good. We didn't see the ceiling of elite. Then we get to Justin Fields. And Justin Fields' athleticism, elite athleticism. And I think that's what we all fell in love with. We fell in love with a guy who was so dynamic running the football that we said, well, and he's got great arm talent. If he can just figure out the passing game, he's going to get there. And for 3 years, he couldn't figure it out. For the Pittsburgh Steelers, got him a little better. Wasn't tremendously better, but he was better with Pittsburgh. But also keep that in mind. When Justin Fields got benched, Russell Wilson wound the clock back about 5 years in this offense and basically would have thrown for 4,000 yards if he was there for 17 games. So keep that in mind. A team with talent around it, a solid offensive line. Most of the time it had some injury issues, but a solid offensive line, some talented receivers, a good offensive coordinator in Arthur Smith, a great head coach in Mike Tomlin, got Justin Fields playing a little bit better. But once Russell Wilson got in there, Russell Wilson lapped absolutely lapped what Justin Fields was doing. So we got to keep that in mind. But with Justin Fields, we saw the athleticism, and that was cause for hope. Like, I think the Colts, and I think Fields was better than Anthony Richardson, so I'm not making a direct comparison, but I think Colts fans see it with Anthony Richardson. If he can just figure everything else out with the athleticism, they're going to have something, but he's really far behind the 8 ball after 2 years, still not completing 50% of his passes. That's a major problem. So when we see Caleb Williams, the difference here is we see elite playmaking with his arm and legs combined. And that's a little different than it was with Justin Fields, and way different than it was with Mitch Trubisky. When we see the 4th down play to DJ Moore, when we see the touchdown pass going against the grain of his body, even the DeAndre Swift pass a few weeks ago when he rolled out and lofted it down the sideline, those are the plays that make Caleb Williams really unique and show potential future coaches just how good he can be. So we saw the potential there, but we still see the issues with coaching. And again, there's no need to pile on Thomas Brown, because Thomas Brown isn't going to be the head coach next year. That was signed, sealed, delivered, that was not happening after 2 weeks. It pretty much was after the 49ers game, but 2 weeks in, after 2 blowout losses, there was absolutely no shot. And of course, Thomas Brown hasn't won a game. 6-3 is the closest he's gotten. That's not exactly winning the hearts of Chicago Bears fans. So when we look at this and see that Thomas Brown was actually going to punt, had to burn a timeout and change his mind, like, what on earth are you thinking, Thomas Brown, at that juncture of the game? Baffling decision there. You know, the bottom line here is the passing game still felt disjointed, still felt that there were issues there. And again, like I said, for weeks, Thomas Brown was not some phenomenal offensive coordinator. It was just a huge step up from what Shane Waldron had been doing those past few weeks. So, you know, we need to keep all that in mind. So I don't want to spend obscene amounts of time on this Seahawks game, other than the fact that when we look at where the Chicago Bears were at Thanksgiving and where they are now, I think all that matters for the future of Ryan Poles. And let's talk about that, because I think that's really all people care about right now. I could sit here and talk about Zach Pickens being inactive and what that means for his future in Chicago. All that is that's a miss for Ryan Poles at this point. We can kind of talk about all this with Ryan Poles and where exactly we are, because the situation here is getting interesting. It's getting interesting in the media, and it's getting interesting because I think people are talking about, talking about Ryan Poles in certain certainties in the media, and it may come back to certain. All right, I'm really babbling here. I'm not expressing things well, which is great for a podcast host. So let me just reset here and let's talk about Ryan Poles. Okay, take 2. Ryan Poles' future in Chicago, I believe right now to be murky. I'm not saying it's murky at Hallis Hall. They may know very well what's going on, but I think they're doing a good job not letting that come out to the general public. All right. Now, Kevin Warren, yes, at Thanksgiving said that Ryan Poles is the GM of this team and Ryan Poles is going to be leading the search. Now, I believe Kevin Warren maybe was leaning towards having Ryan Poles stay, but I think it was probably closer to 50-50 at that point. I don't think Kevin Warren was sold on Ryan Poles. And again, you have to keep in mind that Kevin Warren did not hire Ryan Poles. The Bears did all this backwards. Again, they hired the GM. They basically hired the coach practically before the GM, then brought the GM in, basically gave him a couple choices. He picked his choice, and then they brought in the president. I mean, talk about doing things as backwards as possible. And they knew Ted Phillips was out, because I'll tell you this, and I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast or not, but they did that search in January. I caught wind that Ted Phillips was retiring a month prior. It might even have been around Thanksgiving, that Ted Phillips was going to retire in like 13 months. So I knew that then. Why the Bears had to wait until like the summer with like the Dan Pompei article to say that Ted Phillips was retiring in 6 months, whatever it might be, was a little stupid and ridiculous. But that's what the Chicago Bears do, because they knew, because I knew And if I knew, they all knew. George knew, everyone knew. Everyone knew that Ted Phillips was going to be gone. So at that point, you have to start finding Ted Phillips' replacement, get the president in, have the president involved in the GM search, and of course, the head coaching search. That's how that was supposed to happen, but the Bears didn't do that. They did everything backwards. So now Kevin Warren is coming in with a brand new football operations team, and he is assessing football operations while he's still trying to get a stadium, assess the business side, do everything that the president is doing. It's all-encompassing position. So when we look at this with Ryan Poles, we have to keep in mind that he is not Kevin Warren's guy, that they may have had a good working relationship. But again, that is not the guy that Kevin Warren dubbed that he wanted to be the Chicago Bears general manager under his tenure, right? That was not his decision. It was just, was he going to work with this guy? And if we see what Kevin Warren did, Kevin Warren overhauled a lot in that front office. So it shouldn't be surprising if he would want to overhaul a lot of in football operations. But Kevin Warren at Thanksgiving did say that he's the GM and he's going to lead the coaching search. Now, I also believe that, Ryan Poles probably was saying this coach is the problem. We would have won the Detroit game. If we had a coach, we would have won the Minnesota game. We would have won the Green Bay game. We would have won the Washington game. Suddenly that's 4 more wins under our belt. We just got to get the coaching situation better, and we're going to get this thing resolved. Even if it's too late for this season, we're going to see an uptick. I'm sure that Ryan Poles had to sell that to George and Kevin. That's just absolutely what he needed to do. It's his football operations department. So when you get rid of the coach and everything gets worse, it got worse. We cannot deny it didn't get worse. They got blown out 3 straight weeks under Thomas Brown, then had a limping, sad, pathetic 6-3 loss at home on Thursday Night Football to a jacked up crowd. That crowd was into it, which is why they got so hostile when the Bears played so poorly. So you have to keep that in mind. People want to sit there and say what happened after Eberflus fired doesn't matter. It absolutely does, because the team that Ryan Poles assembled didn't bounce. It didn't bounce like he probably said to Kevin Warren and George McCaskey that it would, that the coach was the issue here, that the coaching problems were what was holding this team back from really competing. Now, again, did the coaching get worse? Is that the problem? That Matt Eberflus, in essence, should have been the defensive coordinator. Thomas Brown should have been the offensive coordinator, and they just didn't have a head coach? That could be the case. And then, of course, you have Thomas Brown as the head coach and Eric Washington as the defensive coordinator, and Washington did not do a good job in that department. So now you've got kind of a play calling defensive coordinator, I should say. Obviously, he's been the defensive coordinator all year. But so now the team has gotten worse. So how is Kevin Warren supposed to assess Ryan Poles right now? So I am to believe, all right, my understanding is that Kevin Warren is, was not fully behind Ryan Poles at Thanksgiving, even if he said it publicly. We all know about the vote of confidence, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But he did say leading the coaching search and other things. So when I see national media members and some local media members saying Ryan Poles is going to be the general manager next year, if you ask them why, and you can talk to them, like I've been able to talk to a few of them, they mention the press conference at Thanksgiving. That's what they're going off of. They're not going off of any information inside Hallis Hall the last couple of weeks. They're going off of Kevin Warren's press conference, where he was very clearly in charge and Ryan Poles looked like a scolded child next to him. And that's the press conference they're going off of to say that Ryan Poles is safe. And to me, I don't think you can go off that for many things. One, because what Kevin Warren says publicly and privately may not be the same thing. 2, it's gotten even messier since that has happened. And 3 is, what else was Kevin Warren supposed to say unless he was firing Ryan Poles in that moment, which you could argue if he was going to fire Ryan Poles, he should have. But again, the Ryan Poles assessment may not have been finished. So now we see a very messy finish to the season. And now we're seeing some jockeying in the media. We see Ryan Poles in his pregame conversation with ESPN 1000 talking about how The Bears' issues stem back to training camp and coaching and how some things weren't cleaned up then that needed to be. Oh, really? Oh, really, Ryan? Well, that's interesting. Let's pile some of that on your guy, Matt Eberflus's plate a little bit more and get it off of yours. That's an interesting tactic. We're also seeing Albert Breer talking about how ownership wants Ryan Poles to be. Now, this was really interesting in the Breer report. Ownership wants Ryan Poles to be the general manager and lead the coaching search. Now, here's why I think that's interesting. And I want you to take all this with a grain of salt. I am not speaking this as fact. I am speaking this as my belief. All right. A lot of the information that the Schefters and the Rapps and the Pelisseros and all these guys get, Breer as well, they get a lot of stuff from agents. They help agents out, right? Like when you see like Rapp, I think a couple of years ago, reported that when Jalen Reagor was on the Vikings, and awful, that there was a lot of interest in Jalen Reagor and teams were calling up the Vikings looking to trade for Jalen Reagor. And then he got cut like a week later because nobody was calling the Vikings because he was a bust at that point. But then 2 weeks later, Rapp breaks that TJ Hawkinson has signed a contract extension with the Vikings. All right. Now, I'm not 100% saying this is what happened, but you talk the Vikings basically talking through Rapp, basically say, all right, we'll give you a juicy piece of information in a couple weeks, but we need you to kind of stoke some fire and see if we can get a trade partner for Jalen Reagor. And then a couple weeks later, he breaks the TJ Hawkinson story. So that kind of stuff happens. So agents will play a part in things like this, but at the same time, so will teams, front offices. They will also utilize guys. We all talked about how Ryan Poles was 100% using Schefter and these guys last spring to try and create a market for Justin Fields of a second-round pick that did not exist. So this kind of jockeying in the media happens. Now, I believe Albert Breer to be close to Ryan Poles or close to someone who is close to Ryan Poles. So I believe a lot of Albert Breer's information comes from Ryan Poles. So if Ryan Poles is leaking to Albert Breer that ownership wants Ryan Poles to stay, that's interesting with Kevin Warren in the mix. Now, I think Kevin Warren has ties to Dan Wiederer, which is interesting with the Wiederer piece that he, of course, put out a couple weeks ago that was very scathing of Ryan Poles. And I believe he also, Kevin Warren, has ties to Tom Pelissero. And all these ties for both those guys go back to Minnesota. So when we see Pelissero with information, I think a lot of times that comes from Kevin Warren. When we see Albert Breer with information, I think a lot of times that comes from Ryan Poles. Again, my belief, not speaking it as fact. This is not a report. I repeat multiple times, I do not want things to be misconstrued. Just my belief of what's going on behind the scenes. So when we look at Ryan Poles potentially leaking information to Albert Breer, this feels like a power jockeying position in the media where Kevin Warren is not married to Ryan Poles. Ryan Poles may know his seat is getting really hot at Hallis Hall, and he's trying to play it through the media. So Kevin Warren has a more difficult time trying to dismiss him, which I think is a distinct possibility. I do not know the future of Ryan Poles 100% at all. I do not know, but I do know this. The Bears are not going to lame duck Ryan Poles next season. They are not going to not extend him or fire him. Those are their two choices. They are not, because if they decide to lame duck Ryan Poles and try and hire a new coach, they are not going to get great coaching candidates. They are going to get a coach more desperate to try and get the job, or someone who wants to try and to overthrow the GM and get him out, like Pete Carroll. Pete Carroll controlled the football operations in Seattle for the most part. So if Pete Carroll would agree to join Ryan Poles in a lame duck situation, it would be so he could get Ryan Poles out of there and get his own guy in there, like that kind of thing. And I'm not saying Pete Carroll would do that. I'm just saying it's a possibility. But a guy like Ben Johnson wants to come in with as clean of a situation as possible. He's not coming here with Ryan Poles on a 1-year contract remaining. Neither is Liam Cohen. Neither is Joe Brady. Those guys are too hot of commodities for that to be the truth. So that's not going to happen. So they need to either extend Ryan Poles or they need to fire him. Now, if you are Kevin Warren and you're assessing the football operations department and the Bears are on a 10, most likely 11-game losing streak going into the offseason here, I assume Packers are a 10-point favorite. Packers need to win to potentially get the 6th seed. You don't want to play the Eagles. I'm sure they would much rather play one of the teams in their division that they're more familiar with, or if that, that would be in round 2. They'd much rather play the Rams or the Bucks. I think it would most likely be the Rams in the opening round than the Eagles. So they are going to want to win and hope the Commanders lose next week. So they're going to have something to play for. So the Packers 10-point favorite, I think the Packers will wipe the floor with the Bears. I think this is another 20-point kind of game. So that's what I thought the first time, and the Bears kept it close. But regardless, I think the Packers handles the situation here easily. So the Bears are now at an 11-game losing streak going into the offseason. And Ryan Poles is the architect of that 11-game losing streak. You want to blame coaching, you want to blame injuries, whatever you want to blame, it doesn't matter. Ryan Poles is at the top of the heap. So when Ryan Poles is sitting there with Kevin Warren talking to Cohen, Brady, Johnson, Vrabel, whoever, and they're sitting there going, why are you so confident in this roster that just lost 11 straight games? Not they had a rough season and went 6-11 or 7-10. They lost 11 straight games and it's current. How are you selling that this is the right general manager to these coaches? I don't think you are. And I think Kevin Warren knows that, which is why if I had to guess, and I'm not reporting, if I had to guess, despite all this that we're seeing from Albert Breer and some of the other insiders that you guys like to look at on social media, I don't think Ryan Poles is safe. I think there's a very good chance that Ryan Poles is fired. I do not think that the Ryan Poles assessment is tied to Ben Johnson and that Ben Johnson comes in interviews and goes, I don't want Ryan Poles here. So they say, okay, Ryan Poles is fired. That's not how this is going to work. And if you think that's how it's going to work, I don't know what to tell you, but they're going to assess Ryan Poles. They're going to determine if he's getting an extension or he's getting fired. Then they are going to go into the head coaching search. That's how this is going to work. And if he's fired, then obviously they'll do the GM and head coach search in tandem, where I think a distinct possibility of having like a Ray Agnew, Ben Johnson combo like the Giants did, and I understand it didn't work, with Joe Shane and Brian Daboll could be a distinct possibility. But regardless of all this, is how, if you are Kevin Warren, do you sell to coaches and to the fan base that this general manager, who has just in the breakout year, not a rebuilding year, those were the first 2 years. This was the year it was supposed to all come together, that this team had such massive regression and are still in the middle of an 11-game losing streak. How are you possibly selling that to your fan base? Because I just don't think you can. I don't see it as a possibility. I just don't. I think Kevin Warren understands the business of football and understands that even if he thinks Ryan Poles has done some good things, and Caleb Williams would not be in Chicago if it wasn't for the Carolina Panthers trade that Ryan Poles pulled off. I get that. But when you assess the full body of work and where the Chicago Bears currently are, it is a very difficult situation to sell an extension for Ryan Poles. It's not that he has 2 years left and you're assessing 1 more year of him. That's totally different. You are assessing if you should give him an extension right now. And that is a very, very difficult situation to be in when you look at the Ryan Poles pieces, because the best players on the team in a lot of ways are not Ryan Poles guys, right? Tevin Jenkins has had a good year when he's been healthy. That's not a Ryan Poles guy. Darnell Wright has been playing well. Ryan Poles, tip of the cap. And again, the Darnell Wright is tied in to that Carolina Panthers trade, as is DJ Moore, as is Caleb Williams. Tyreek Stevenson's tied into that, but Tyreek Stevenson has regressed this year. Kyler Gordon has not progressed. He hasn't regressed, I don't believe, but hasn't progressed like you would have hoped. That's where we're sitting there. Tremaine Edmonds has definitely started flatlining again, not playing as well as he was earlier in the season. 100% has not lived up to that contract. Whether Matt Eberflus wanted that or not, Ryan Poles still was the guy who signed him. That hasn't worked out. Zach Pickens is another pick, 64th pick overall. It was the first pick of the third round, but because of a forfeited pick, it was in essence a second round pick because the top 64 picks are second round picks. Zach Pickens was inactive, and a guy they picked up off the Packers practice squad a week and a half ago was active and on the field, and Zach Pickens, a healthy scratch. Dominique Robinson, not playing significant, time. These are, and again, it's a fifth round pick, it's a third round pick. Gervon Dexter, been banged up a little bit, got better, but again, I don't know. Again, I just don't see the all-around playmaking ability there. He's a decent interior pass rusher. He's pretty good, but he is not a monster difference maker. We are lacking the monstrous difference makers for the Chicago Bears, and a lot of the ones that are here, Cole Kmet, he signed Cole Kmet to an extension. That's not his guy. Jalen Johnson, he wanted to trade, and Jalen Johnson is not his guy. These are Ryan Pace guys. You got to keep in mind, what is the evaluation here? The evaluation here is that Ryan Poles did not want George Pickens because he was a headache. Ryan Poles did not want Jalen Carter because he was a headache. And now we're even talking about Malik Neighbors. Why no? Ryan Poles did not want Malik Neighbors because he's a headache. And if you don't want headaches, you're going to pass on some blue chip talent. And those guys look like blue chip guys. And Ryan Poles hasn't brought in the blue chip guys. And that's a problem. And that's where Kevin Warren is right now, is assessing, is Ryan Poles the general manager that's going to put enough talent around Caleb Williams to make this a Super Bowl contender? And I have a hard time believing. And again, my opinion and what I'm hearing, it kind of swirls together and it kind of forms its own opinion. But it is really hard for me. It is tough to separate it sometimes. It's really hard for me to see how Kevin Warren is going to assess this situation and extend Ryan Poles. Now, I could be wrong, and I'm saying that right now. I am not slamming my fist on the table and telling you what's going to happen. I'm just going to say that I believe that, contrary to reports, rumors, whatever, that Ryan Poles is not 100% getting extended. He is not 100% safe. I think Kevin Warren's probably made up his mind. I think there's some questions there. I don't think this is a certainty. And I think it's Kevin Warren's decision. I don't think it's George McCaskey's decision. Now, good, George McCaskey could step in 100%. But again, I think he's taken a step back and he's really trying to let Kevin Warren take control of this thing, because I think George understands that what he's tried to do has failed. So that's where we are with the Chicago Bears. So we got a game left here. It's the Green Bay Packers. Again, I think the Packers are going to crush the Bears. I think we're looking at like a 34-17 loss for the Bears here. I think the offense will look a little better. I think they'll let Caleb chuck it a little bit, make sure he gets his 20th touchdown of the season, make sure he moves up that yardage list, maybe gets top 4, top 3 all-time in Bears history for passing yardage in a season. Why not? You got nothing else to play for. Of course, they're going to try and break the streak here and end the season with a win. I just don't know if they're going to be able to do that for a Packers team that's going to want to try and jump from the 7 seed to the 6 seed after losing last week. So we're going to be in an interesting situation here. Black Monday, maybe even Sunday, we'll hear Ryan Poles' fate. Again, for me, I would look at Tom Pelissero or Ian Rappaport, because sometimes I think Pelissero gives Rapp information as well. That's where I would look for this information to break. Of course, Schefter can always usurp everyone, but I think the future of Ryan Poles will be, and I said that Matt Eberflus would be broken by Tom Pelissero, and it was. I think the same goes for Ryan Poles. Tom Pelissero is the guy to watch, not Albert Breer. I know a lot of Bears fans think Breer is the guy. I think Tom Pelissero is the guy to watch to find out if Ryan Poles is safe and will continue to lead this head coaching search, or if it is going to be a new general manager leading the Chicago Bears in 2025. So again, we will be back next week after the Packers game and after we have learned Ryan Poles' fate. We will talk about a potential new GM or how Ryan Poles fits into the head coaching search. And of course, the head coaching search, we will start hearing some names and some directions that the Chicago Bears could go in this coaching search. So that's going to do it for Bears Banter. We'll talk to you next week. Bear down, everybody. Adios.